Guru Nation, Ethan Bond is here. This is somebody you gotta follow on LinkedIn. His LinkedIn is underneath the video and in the show notes. He's the co-founder and CEO of Select IQ. He spent a lot of time, I'm talking like 7 years, at Palantir, which used to be a meme stock, but is now a legit company in and of itself. I know a lot of the viewers are interested in that. And his career took a lot of interesting turns within clinical research. He even had a stint at Facebook, and he's a computer science guy, product tech design, product strategy at Palantir, and now co-founder, and CEO of Select IQ. So, Ethan, thank you for coming on, man. This is a pleasure to have you here.
Sure thing, Dan. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I've consumed all of your material. Everything I could find was a big part of how I sort of wound up in this space post Palantir. So yeah, I owe a huge thanks to you.
PP.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah. Brad Hightower and Dr. Fox and all the compadres have been huge. So happy to be on this side of it.
All the troublemakers in this space. Here's
That's
to the troublemaker. What did Steve Jobs say? Here's to the misfits.
That's right.
All right. Well, welcome to Team Misfits, and we're gonna get into why you founded your company. But how did you find research?
Yeah. So basically, at Palantir, so I come from a software engineering and software design background. Interned twice at Palantir on very different things, and once at Facebook, decided I didn't like Facebook all that much. Went back to Palantir full time.
Did you meet Zucks?
I did not. Facebook was already a gigantic company at that point. Too big for my taste, it turned
What
out.
about CEO of Palantir? You meet him?
Yes, yeah, and the COO Sham, I owe a lot of my career to.
Wow.
So yeah, so Palantir works a big data company, works in a lot of different sectors. My career is mostly on the commercial end of the spectrum. I did a little bit of work with some intelligence agencies, and then with oil and gas production. And then after a few years into my career there, Sham essentially pulled me aside. It was like, "Hey, go cure cancer." And I was like, that was as broad as the mandate was.
That was literally what he said?
That was the mandate, yeah. And so that is how Palantir operates. And so from there, it was just sort of like figure out what sort of dent I could make in the whole system. And I think luckily Palantir has access to a lot of different organizations. And so I was able to work with a very large cancer center, was able to work with Novartis and some other large pharma companies. And then with COVID, NIH, obviously, like COVID kind of reversed a lot of, or kind of refocused a lot of the industry, and was able to move over to the NIH work with Palantir, which was really about building kind of the largest, I think to my knowledge, it's still the largest patient database in the United States. And so they basically, all the NIH research partners were essentially pooling their clinical data to try to understand COVID. Which obviously involved a whole lot of sort of like privacy and data governance concerns. And so that was kind of my bread and butter, was really developing the data governance scheme that was used to build out that NIH data set.
Wow. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. For the lay people that don't know, because this is the majority of this are research audience, clinical research audience.
Sure.
We'll give something for the Palantir nerds out there as well, but for the research audience, I mean, many of them never heard of Palantir. Can you kind of give like a macro overview of what this company actually does?
Totally, yeah. So Palantir builds software. It's a software company. It builds a few very, very large, gigantic pieces of software that are extremely expensive. And what those pieces of software do is essentially data integration. So you have, as a government or as a large, a very, very large enterprise, you have tons of data. It's scattered in a million different systems owned by thousands of different people. And the question is like, how can the enterprise actually leverage all of that data that it has? And what Palantir does is build software that facilitates that. So it connects to all those data sets, ties them up into a nice security architecture, and then makes that data accessible to the people who need it, and in particular through the interfaces that they would like to interact with that data through, right? So, like,
Mm.
if not everybody is a data scientist, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not going to be writing R and Python against a data set. So Palantir also provides kind of these different UIs, which was a lot of my job as a product designer. There was developing these UIs that are more purpose built. Like, how do you create something that allows an idiot like me to interact with data and answer the questions that I need to answer with it.
More like an idiot like me. But so their clients are typically government or Fortune 500 companies. You said Novartis
Yeah,
was one.
yeah,
And so the
yeah,
COO literally pulled you aside one day and said, "Hey, let's go cure cancer."
yeah. So Palantir had
That's
entered into
ambitious, man.
a yeah, entered into a joint venture with Merck, the German Merck. So that joint venture is called Syntropy, and so I was on the founding team of Syntropy, and that was essentially kind of setting out. It's like, hey, all these different institutions have all of this different data. Everybody has different pieces of the puzzle of cancer. How can we build the infrastructure to allow us to pool all those pieces so we can start actually figuring it out? And so this is a combination of, I think, very interesting technical problems in dealing with kind of all of this very complex, high scale data, but also a lot of just like kind of there's legal questions, there's like ethical questions, and there's also just like business model questions of like cancer hospitals, for example, like their data asset is an asset to them. It's very similar to the sort of relationship you see with like providers referring patients to trial sites. Like, one, they don't want to lose their patient, and two, like they also don't generally want to expose their entire patient database to a trial site. Even if they want to collaborate with that trial site, like those are things that they generally are not going to want to do. And so the question for Palantir at that scale, and I think also the question for Select IQ at the trial site scale, is basically that: is like, how do you kind of account for all these very legitimate, distinct interests, right? And can technology like actually facilitate that like resolution of those different interests?
So like what as far as Palantir, like with this Merck example, if you whatever you're able to discuss, what were like just let's make it like real practical so people can understand. What were Merck's raw ingredients? They're like, here's our mess, like here's everything we have. Make it what's the output? Like something usable when it comes to oncology research? Like can you just kind of walk us through what that actually means?
Yeah, so I can't go into like a ton of detail on this, but I think like the very zoomed out version of this is pretty basic, which is like pharmaceutical companies have the expertise and the capital and the incentives to produce new therapies. What they don't have, or what is very very expensive for them to get, is data about patients. And then on the flip side, you have, right, the way that they do that is clinical trials, and we all know how expensive clinical trials are. Now, on the flip side, you have large clinics or research hospitals that do not produce therapies. They don't have the incentives. They're not going to become a pharma company, but they do have tons of data about patients. And so, like, that's sort of the question: is like, how do you bring these things together? And so that's kind of like the zoomed out version of that problem, which is probably the level of detail that I can get into at
Yeah,
this point.
yeah, fair enough. I mean, that bridge, it's essentially a bridge between, the real world data, which is the clinics, and the pharma looking to develop. Weren't the CROs supposed to do this? Like, doesn't that kind of come into CRO territory? CRO business
I,
objectives?
I mean, I would have to imagine that CROs are probably plugged in somewhere along this process, but I mean, this stuff is happening. And so my work completely was really outside of the context of clinical trials themselves.
Mm,
Right. So the work kind of with Syntropy was like kind of much more around trying to do more, closer to RWE, RWD type interaction. The work that we were doing with other pharma companies was also on clinical trial data, but it wasn't attached to the clinical trial itself. So this was actually secondary analysis, which was basically, hey, I'm a pharma company. I have 100 years of historical data about all the trials that I've run. Those costed me ludicrous amounts of money to produce that data. Is there any other additional value that we can get out of it? Can we ask kind of secondary questions of this data, and in particular look for a label expansion opportunity, right? So you can kind of imagine it as like invalidating a hypothesis. Like we have this hypothesis. Do we already have the data that says this hypothesis is not correct? Or look for like a label expansion opportunity. Do we have data that says a drug, we should be actually maybe doing another trial on a drug for a new indication? And can we kind of cut out some of that initial upfront cost of development?
Yeah, and this is where we could get in the weeds and discuss what makes Palantir unique, but we won't do that because that's probably for another show.
Sure.
But in your opinion, where is Palantir as far as their potential? Like, are they? Is there another company that can do this? First of all, like what Palantir does?
I would be surprised. I think it's a very unique organization with a very unique product. It's very flexible, and it comes with there are pros and cons to flexibility and adaptability, both at the organization level and at the product level. But yeah, I mean, the company is everywhere, and it does great work in tons and tons of different industries. It turns out that everybody has data. If you are a large enterprise, you have data,
Everyone
and
has
like
data.
and especially now, it's like with the AI boom, like everybody is looking at the data and saying, what else can I do with this? And you need infrastructure to be able to do that.
Well, even bringing it back home to the research sites, right? Um, Still only like 30% of sites actually use eSource. But that
Hmm.
number is gonna eventually be 100, probably
Yeah,
in this next century.
in the
So
next century, I hope.
right
Yeah,
now, Palantir maybe is working with governments and big corporations, but pretty soon there's gonna be a demand from small businesses and even
yeah,
from just people.
yeah.
And it's just so it's like a paradigm shift to like truly understand this company. Because at the end of the day, I mean, there's proprietary algorithms, probably a bunch of AI, but aren't those things like commodities? Like I'm just trying to figure out like what makes Palantir so unique. Is it really just as simple as they're the first ones to put it all together and the first advantage, like first mover advantage or whatever it's called?
So I think from my perspective, and this is something that I'm trying to bring, obviously, to the trial space via Select IQ, is really meeting people where they are. So you mentioned like eSource, right? Like, okay, yeah, you can build software for the imaginary world in which everybody is on eSource, or you can meet people where they are, which is like they're doing a lot of their work on paper. And so, how can you accept that reality and still deliver advantages to those people? The real world, like organizations that you would hope uh, you know, have none of the sort of like data problems that exist. Like you'd be very shocked at how duct taped together the real world is what I what working in oil and gas and going
Wow.
to an oil field and seeing actually how a field is operated or how a refinery is operated. It honestly scared me, and that has been the case with every industry that I've worked in. And I think accepting that reality and saying like, okay, yeah, so and so, like X% of sites are on paper, and how then are you going to deliver value to them? Like that's the critical question. That's the thing I think that Palantir is really good at doing culturally. It's kind of a cultural component. Um, and yeah, I think it's an important thing to bring when you're bringing technology to a new industry.
Yeah, it's one of those companies where not financial advice, by the way. I own some shares, and I still don't understand like exactly what they do. But I bought
Yeah,
shares when I figured out that they got into life sciences, and this was
yeah.
before the AI hype. I think 2019 was when I got into it. And I watched like a presentation. I even did a video on my channel. Um, But yeah, it's so interesting. Like I think it's just the tip of the iceberg of what we can actually see. But you must have been inspired
Totally.
at your time there. I mean, you spent almost 7 years there.
Yeah.
You must have seen something or been inspired by something to want to bring this to clinical research with your new
Yeah.
company.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah. So full disclosure, like we didn't start when we left Palantir. To be honest, we were pretty burnt out on life sciences and on pharma. It was a brutal several years. It is just nose to the grindstone, trying to eke out some value. And so actually, when we left, we my co-founder also came from Palantir. My good friend worked with me for many years in life sciences, and we we actually started building software for other software companies, basically for us, essentially. Like, hey, uh, being a product person at a big software company was really hard. So, like, what can we do to make that easier? And we spent a year doing that, and came to the realization that, like, software people don't have real problems, and actually we should go to an industry that does have real problems, and that hasn't actually been well served by software. And we kind of created a huge list, a huge of possible industries that we could look at. One of those, obviously, was back into pharma land, back into life sciences,
You hated that.
and I was thrilled. I mean, both of us loved so much of it, right? Like the mission component of, like, whatever it is that you're doing. At the end of the day, if you provide value, you're getting better, faster, cheaper treatments to patients. The mission component is obviously incredible, right? And then in addition to that, it's a very complex space, which I think is cognitively very interesting. There's, I think, really great, very smart people. You're interacting with a lot of interesting people, and so we were really excited to actually, after a year of distraction, we were excited to get back into this space. And what we did was essentially, zoomed out and looked at the overall space of pharma, and we're like, what is the primary bottleneck on getting drugs to market? It's clinical trials. Okay, now what is the primary bottleneck on clinical trials? It's a bottleneck at the site level. Like, it's a lot of it
Yeah.
is patient recruitment,
Yep.
but yeah, it's like a bottleneck at where the value is actually happening. And I would say that this is another kind of Palantir cultural thing coming through. Is like, at the end of the day, like, the value is created at the lowest levels of the system, right? It's like at the ground truth is where that value is created. And that's where you've got to be moving the levers. And so that's kind of what we started on, and I think your content was incredibly helpful for navigating down to that ground level as quickly as possible.
You're really practical. The sites are so interesting. It's where the rubber meets the road. It's where everything happens. It's where all these big pharma, no matter how many consultants they contract and say, give us the next big idea or like, what can we do? I mean, they could pay millions of dollars to figure out like a target. If the sites are not on board, that's it. Like it's not never gonna have a
Totally.
chance. So now there's a lot
Yeah.
of startups emerging from bottom up. Like, hey, let's see what the sites actually want and let's
Yeah.
make that work. Let's figure out I think it's actually easier. Let's make figure out how that can give value to big pharma, like what their objectives that they want, as opposed to just like forcing forcing down on
Exactly.
what the sites should do.
Yeah.
Interesting. You said something I want to like. I have to ask. Software businesses don't need don't need help, or what did you say?
Yeah. Software companies don't have real problems. It's not to say that they don't have real problems, but
It's all
they're very
customer
well served.
acquisition, or what is the problem?
Well, so we were working at, like, building software for project management, basically, and kind of so one piece of startup advice you hear very frequently is, like, solve your own problems. But the issue with that is, if you have an industry of very talented software builders who are being told to solve their own problems when they create a new product, then you have a very, very well served market, right? Of people all solving their own problems, and they're actually good at solving them with software.
Yeah.
And this is, as opposed to, I mean, in the trial space, I think it's very good advice, actually, if you are not coming from from a software company. So I know, like, a lot of the most successful businesses in clinical trials are started by people who run a trial site. right?
Mhm.
And they're like, hey, I have this really pressing problem, and I'm going to hack my way through the software component of it until I get to a solution. And that's amazing. I mean, that's super valuable.
One of our
Yeah, it just
sponsors,
does. I think does
Creo. Creo is
exactly.
a
Yeah.
perfect example. Raymond Omizu was a site owner.
Yep.
He thought, "Hey, you know what? There's gotta be a better way. This is frustrating," and he slowly made Creo, like, now it's one of the industry's leading eSource, eReg, CTMS providers, so
Yeah, and people
exactly
love it.
right.
Yeah, people love it.
People
Yeah,
love
because
it.
it's clearly made by somebody who like knows the reality of the situation, right?
So when you set out to start Select IQ, uh, when you honed in on pharma and then you honed in on who in particular in life sciences, was it the sites that you honed in on?
Yeah, it was the sites, and I think honestly a large part of that was because of your content. Basically, it was and it's like not also just pharma compared to we're looking at like semiconductors and construction and like climate tech, but at the end of the day, if we're trying to reach out to people to learn about what their problems are, and we can get we have one meeting per week or something, or four meetings per week for the next 3 months to learn about a problem, versus we have Dan's videos and we have hours and hours of content that we can just like tear through. At a certain point, it's just easier to build conviction in the space that is kind of transparent about what's going on, and like that has people, people like yourselves like sharing what's going on. And that was also true. Even I think it's partially you and the all your cohort, but
SOS
also like
peeps, man.
the SOS peeps. I think also like we went to SCRS, and there's a culture, I think, of transparency as well. It seems to me, as somewhat an outsider, people seem perfectly happy to talk about their problems, and that just makes it easier. Like there's obviously the first order benefit of now you guys can all discuss your problems, and what you're trying and what's working and what's not. The second order benefit is people like me can come in now and like I want to solve your problems, and I can understand what those are, right? So like hopefully you wind up with better tools. um, yeah, so I think that's kind of how we wound up in the site space, was like partially just is very easy to navigate.
Uh, Interesting. And I think we're in the golden era of site-centric tools. It's just beginning. Would you
Yeah.
consider your company as site-centric, or is it primarily
Oh,
like
definitely.
site focused?
Definitely. Yeah. So we're calling Select IQ basically a provider activation platform. And essentially what that's trying to kind of key into is our understanding is the relationship between a site and their providers, whether those are closely affiliated, so your PIs and sub-Is, or they're more loosely affiliated, like external, folks from med school, people down the road. That relationship is really important to a site's growth, and to a site's survival, and to their patient flow. And there's a lot of complexity and a lot of friction in those relationships. A lot of like manual work, and there's like payment complexity, there's like legal complexity, there's data transfer complexity, and I think the biggest thing is just there's like cognitive load complexity. Like it's very hard to what we've heard is it's very hard for a site to kind of just keep their trials top of mind for a provider. Providers are super busy, right? They're absolutely underwater 100% of the time. And then you're just going to kind of layer on this like, hey, well, if you see a patient who matches these really specific crazy criteria, send them our way. And that's a hard thing to do in clinic. And so all those sorts of things are kind of things that we want to chip away at. So I think it is site focused, but it's really about the interface between sites and providers more than anything.
And how does it work?
Yeah, yeah. So the specific sub problem we're focusing on is more of that like patient eligibility component, and essentially the way this works is like Dan, you would as Yuma would kind of publish the trial that you're recruiting for, and your referring providers can install our app on their EHR, and essentially we will rank the patients who they're seeing based on their likely eligibility for that trial. And there's kind of a future looking version of this, which I would say is kind of this on the front of like reducing cognitive load for the clinician is like, we'll produce a daily printout for your clinician and say, hey, you're seeing Ethan at 2 p.m. Ethan might be a good match for this particular trial. If you'd like to bring it up with him, like here's a sheet of paper of like what is going on at this trial and like how Ethan can enroll if he wants to do that. And then for kind of harder to fill trials, there's also the retrospective version, which is just like go look through all of the EHR records and just like find me anybody who seems like they should match, regardless of whether they're planning to come in the near future or not.
I mean, it sounds amazing. It's actually sounds like something every site needs.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I agree.
The issue is like cost. Is it affordable?
Totally. Yeah.
Another issue is, because I'm already thinking as you're explaining it, I was talking to my PI about getting something like this. His main concern is like, we cannot afford to have it screw up our EMRs. Like even for an hour, we can't have this thing down, slowing it down.
Totally. Yeah.
That's even more important than the cost, honestly,
Yeah.
for these guys. So what?
Totally.
Surely you're aware of this.
No, totally. I mean, I think this similar with like Palantir. It's like we were building like operational mission critical software. When Palantir software broke, like oil wells would shut off, or like planes can't fly, right? Like they can't schedule the aircraft. And so that is very much, I think, it's very, very top of mind. Like if you disrupt the business operations, like you're toast. And so that's very top of mind.
Tough business.
Yeah, totally. Well, this is the reality of software, though, right? It's like, and more and more so. You can't be building software and saying, "Hey, pay me a ton of money and make your business dependent on me, but if it breaks, don't call me," right? Like, and so yeah, that's very top of mind. The price component, we're still trying to figure out, I think, how we're thinking about price in the specific. But I think in the general, like, SCRS is and your content as well. It's a constant refrain. Like the cash flow issues at the site level are significant, right? And that's hard in the software business because software entails such an enormous upfront cost to develop that it's a little tricky to be like charging very, very little or charging pennies or charging nothing. But I think fortunately, right, at the end of the day, the sponsors, like, they benefit. Like anything that we do to speed up recruitment, anything that we do to enhance that relationship between the site and the provider ultimately benefits the sponsor. And I know, having worked on the pharma side, they have no problem paying for things that they think will work.
Zero problem.
Zero problem. Yeah, they will pay for things that have a believable chance at working.
The problem with big
we'll
pharma,
demonstrate that it does.
The problem with pharma, and not just big pharma, all of the sponsors, is they've heard it all before. Yeah. They've heard how this is going to change our study, and they're so jaded. Totally. They hear this from every reason. Recruitment vendor. You're not a recruitment vendor. You're more of a EHR mining, in a way, like a mining company. But like they hear this from recruitment vendors too. Oh well, $15,000 for a 3-month contract for referrals. Yeah. Well, okay, we'll pay, but how do we know those patients are actually going to come screen, and even more so randomize? So they've heard it all. They're jaded. They kind of want to see it work before they pay for it. And then sites are like left in between. Like, do we risk it and just like show them that it's going to work, or like how do we do it? Like somebody has to take the initial risk. That's the problem.
Totally.
No one wants to take that initial risk.
Absolutely. And I think this goes to my kind of initial LinkedIn comment where I was like, hey, like the resolution of this issue of like site not having a ton of money, sponsor having a ton of money, but they're jaded. The resolution of this issue can't be, we're just going to build things that aren't useful for the site, right? Like you have to build the thing that's useful for the site regardless. Right. But you might need to be a little clever on the business model, right? Like how do you wiggle this out in a way that, that we're taking on the risk of it not working. And this, I think, again, is like actually a very big Palantir thing. Is like Palantir was doing huge free pilots, like that cost tons and tons of money for Palantir for a long, long time. And it was basically like, hey, when we get to the end result, like the result's going to speak for itself, and then you're going to pay us. And that I think we're taking that approach. Like we're going to build something that helps you guys, and if it doesn't help, you guys. If it doesn't help the sponsor, then like why should we get paid?
That's the chat. That's the B2B, like, B2B companies, they don't do advertising, but that's their, if they were to have advertising budget, that's where it's going to. It's like, use our stuff for free.
Right.
And if it works, that's our ad right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's a tricky dynamic, and I think the pharma companies being burned is a really great point. Like they are burned over and over and over again by service providers, by software companies, and I think it makes it a really gnarly situation. Like they need to be kind of maybe not to get into too much detail, but there's a big gap between the people at a pharma company who have large discretionary budget to spend on kind of experimental out their ideas. And then there's a huge gap of support. And then you have people who are like, no, this needs to be like demonstrated financial upside for the company, or we're not touching it at all. And so it's hard for a startup because you're kind of pitching this like big aspirational thing. But then the big aspirational thing is often not the thing that's actually going to move the needle for the business. And so you kind of have to navigate this like this shaky situation of sell the big thing, but deliver the real, oftentimes very boring incremental improvement in productivity.
Yeah, and the bigger the pharma is, I mean, whether people like to admit it or not, this is the industry with the most regulatory capture by far. That's created an
Yeah.
environment, especially at the big pharma and at the regulatory levels, of revolving door. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Doesn't matter if the product's good, I'll get it through
Right. Right.
because we'll accept mediocre. So I'll take a mediocre product over a great one if the mediocre one's buttering me up somehow,
Sure. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think that trickles down into the software and the tech vendors, unfortunately. And it's a
Yeah.
game that we all unofficially have to play to some extent, which really sucks.
Well, and I think the regulatory environment also just provides a really easy cop out not to do anything innovative and not to do anything clever or unique, right? Because there's a legitimate fear. Like the regulations exist for a reason, for the most part, right? And they are the enforcement is real, so the fear is legitimate. But I mean, what I experience a lot of times is like, like HIPAA, for example. It's like people will just kind of say HIPAA is like scary, and therefore we can't try anything new. And it's like, well, you can read HIPAA and you can like understand what you're able to do and what you're not able to do. And usually you're actually able to do a lot more than what people think. And that's not to say that, that the legal requirements should be the ceiling of your care about these issues. They need to be the floor, right?
Right.
Everybody needs to walk away feeling good about what's going on, including the patients, of course. But there's usually a lot more room for creativity than people would think, given the regulatory environment.
Totally agree. It's not a green light to be cavalier about important things, but it's also not an automatic red light just because you feel like putting it up when you want to. The
Exactly.
Sunshine Act, perfect example, has nothing to do with research payments. Nothing. For years, they're still trying to use this in negotiating tactic, but they could figure out if the person on the other end knows or not. But it has nothing to do with research payments.
Right. Right.
But they've been using it. That was an automatic red light, automatic stop sign for so many sites. It's finally starting to kind of lose power, but it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
a
Good.
decade later.
Totally. Yeah. These things. Yeah. They last a long time once they get kind of into people's head.
Hmm. Hmm. So, do you guys have? Are you like straight to market yet for sites? Like, or are you trying on the sponsors first?
No, we're going straight to sites.
Mm.
Yeah, so we have a wait list on our website. Feel free to sign up, and we'll be kind of churning through it. I mean, like I said, like we're focused on delivering actual value, so we want to be doing that kind of step by step with people who we bring on. Um, but yeah, we're going straight to sites, and I think uh, we're doing it with an eye towards the fact that of Site's financial situation, not being cavalier about that, and
Broke
I think
sites, Ethan.
yeah, basically
Eighty
yeah.
percent of sites. This is crazy. 80% of sites don't have 3 months of cash flow operating expenses in their bank account.
It's nuts. Absolutely nuts. Yeah, yeah. And I think if you want to build software in this space, like you can't be ignorant of that or arrogant of it, right? Um, yeah, and I think at the end of the day, we're confident if we can build something that speeds stuff up, then we'll figure out a way to get paid for it.
Yeah, and the cool thing about tech is it's a deflationary force. So once it's proven, I think this is why it is important to be first to market or one of the first, because that's where the margins are. Because ultimately, competition increases, everything goes down, and
Yeah,
eventually it just becomes like standard. Like, oh, well, we get patients like falling out of the sky in our e-source because
yeah, yeah.
that's just how it is. Like, I'm pretty sure in like 2 or 3 decades, you'll have patient leads. Like, as soon as you open your e-source, like, oh, screen this person.
Yeah,
Maybe they're already scheduled for
yeah.
you.
I hope so. Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. I
today,
mean,
that's like
that's
it's so hard to do that, like, just to get that done, I think ultimately the deflationary aspects of these successful things become commoditized, but we're definitely far from that, so you're in the early,
yeah, yeah,
early
yeah.
phase of this.
Yeah, good technology is a time machine, right? It like takes a thing that took 10 hours and makes it 30 seconds. And you like just like magic, you have produced a new time.
Or it makes it, like, just passively happen, like, you don't even have to
Yeah,
do
right,
anything, right?
right, right.
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, we'll have to do, like, part 2s and 3s because just to get into the EHR part of this story, and I'm dealing with that right now with 3 of my PIs. All 3 have different EHR systems. They're all in different locations. One wants to call the patients himself, but he's getting
Right.
the leads for us. The other says, do whatever you want, just don't slow down our thing, and hopefully it doesn't cost too much. And the other
Yeah,
one's down for basically whatever. But I know if I'm
yeah,
dealing with this, other sites are as well, like
yeah.
at scale, and we are looking for solutions, but
Great.
there's
Yeah,
a lot of
we'd love to help you out. I mean, even not like as a commercial relationship, my co-founder has been digging into the EHR craziness right now, and we're happy to just like kind of offer some thoughts if we can help move that forward.
Sure. And thank you for coming on and sharing a little bit about your career. I think it's like really cool how you got in, and especially from Palantir. I think that even though it's not really a household name, I think it eventually will be. And certainly for the B2B people, that definitely carries some weight around, and
Yeah, I
we'll
hope
give
so. Yeah, yeah,
some little Palantir nuggets for the community, for the meme stock people out there.
yeah,
But
yeah.
we gotta do part 2 maybe on just mining the databases, because
Sure.
that's like an hour-long podcast right there.
It's tricky business. Yeah, I mean that was our. I spent way too much time in front of a whiteboard trying to figure out how to apply inclusion exclusion criteria to clinical data sets, and so now I get to use that power for good at the site level.
Even just like, I mean, I'm not even that deep into it. Just trying to find the diagnosis with like the main criteria being met. Not even like all of it, just the main criteria. Is this person worth bothering my provider about?
Yeah,
Or should I even
right,
call this patient? Like, in one of my sites, we have a green light to call the patients whenever we want, but sometimes it doesn't make sense because we don't know all the IE criteria. Like, we just want the
right,
diagnosis, basically.
right,
Then
right.
we'll deal with it
Well, so
later.
so this falls into that category of when you go to a new industry and you realize like, wow, this is really duct taped together. The fact that this is not trivial, that this is not completely solved, is crazy, right? And like, hopefully, we'll get it solved.
Not even close to being solved, man. So
Yeah,
thank you, Ethan. It was nice to meet you, and
You
We'll
as well,
definitely
Dan.
do a part two. Everybody go connect with Ethan. Are you coming SOS? I'll put you on the spot, but are you going to be out
I
there?
I am. That is the
Ooh,
that's the plan so far. I've not bought my ticket yet, but I guess I have to now. So
awesome, man. Well,
yeah,
we'll definitely do a part two, and I'll meet you in person for SOS. Everybody go
awesome.
connect with Ethan. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and stay tuned for more, guys. Bye bye.
Thanks a bunch, Dan. See ya.